What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sitdown. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please make sure you hit the like button and let me know what you think in the comment section below. Also, if you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet, or you're living under a rock, I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button below now so you never miss another Sitdown video. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to get into another mafia topic, and I've taken responsibility in detailing on this channel the many different mob farm teams. We've done profiles on Dino Calabro, Paul Ragusa, Anthony Aiello, and others. Today, we are going to discuss arguably the most violent of them all. There are many farm teams in the 80s and 90s, but many cannot take the claim that they were more violent than today's subject. The story of hood legend Vito Guzzo. Next on Sitdown Shorts, Vito Guzzo Jr. was born in 1965 in Middle Village, Queens. He would live at 78th Street in that area. Now, interestingly enough, he would actually come up as the son of a mobster. His father, Vito Guzzo Sr., had been very involved in the mafia and in criminality really since the 50s. Vito Guzzo Sr. was a career criminal, and in the early 50s, he would be arrested for robbery offenses and was involved in bookmaking, extortion, and loan sharking. In 1973, Vito Guzzo Sr. was actually convicted of criminally negligent homicide and given 4 years in prison and get out in 1977. At that point, he would become a made member of the Colombo crime family. Now, it was said that he came up in the crew of legendary Colombo higher-up Benny Alloy, and he would work out of Benny Alloy Social Club, the Trophy Room in Middle Village. Now, the caretaker and associate of the crew and in that Trophy Room was an individual called Dennis Gazzato, who was an associate of Vito Guzzo Sr., and would ultimately become a mentor to Vito Guzzo Jr. Now, in 1984, a very interesting story would come out involving Vito Guzzo Jr. and Vito Guzzo Sr. The federal government and the NYPD at one point would want to speak to Guzzo Jr. about an alleged baseball bat attack in which the 19-year-old Guzzo Jr. would beat an individual. At that point, the NYPD would come to the home of Vito Guzzo Sr. in Middle Village. They would attempt to arrest Jr. During the arrest, Guzzo Sr. in a bathrobe would run out of the house and attack the NYPD officers. It would allow Guzzo Jr. to get away, and Sr. would take a pinch for assaulting a police officer. In 1984, they would allegedly hit both of these individuals as well with contempt, including Vito Guzzo Jr. for not answering questions on this assault. Now, it was very clear Vito Guzzo Sr. was a great father, and his son allegedly adored him. In 1987, though, Vito Guzzo Jr. would have to deal with unspeakable tragedy, particularly in his family. That year, his father, Vito Guzzo Sr., would head on a hunting trip with associates of his crime family, including an individual called Vincent Vinny Unions Ricciardo. Now, sadly for Guzzo Jr., his father would not return from that hunting trip in 1987. And it was very clear he was probably killed by members of his own crime family. It's unclear why he was killed, but young Vito Guzzo, as many of us would, wanted revenge. The problem for him, though, was he was only 22 years old. He was basically not even an associate of the crime family, and he wasn't just going to be able to take out a high-ranking member of the family without pushback. Now, as I said, he would be under the tutelage of his mentor, Dennis Gazzato, who actually really reined him in and basically said, look, you can't do this. And we liken it to when John Gotti wanted to kill Paul Castellano, but Neil Della Croce basically held him back on basically a smaller scale in this case. Now, Vito Guzzo would vow for revenge, but this wouldn't prevent him from getting very involved with the life. We have to realize, as usual, when it comes to a young member of the mafia or an associate of the mafia. Most of these individuals' fates are decided for them. For Vito Guzzo, it was no secret. He had a temper. His father had a temper. His half brother Anthony had a temper. They all had tempers. Vito Guzzo's future had already been decided for him. In the late 80s, Vito Guzzo would get into the drug trade and ultimately start committing bank robberies, arson for hire, and would start hanging out with members of a violent group called the Cafe Giannini Crew, which we've done videos on before. This group would work out of a cafe in Middle Village, Queens, called Cafe Giannini, and it was run by Banano Zip, Baldo Amato. It's important to understand, though, all the members of the Giannini Crew, very few of them at this time, in fact, none of them were made members of the mafia. They basically did pieces of work for all sorts of different people, including Patty Catalano, Baldo Amato, Bobby Glasses Vernace. They all kind of kicked up to other members of other crews. No one was really under the tutelage of anyone. They were just basically associates of the mafia. Now, Vito Guzzo would obviously work with Dennis Gazzato and would actually end up ultimately kicking up to Fat Patty Catalano. Now, in 1991, Vito Guzzo had no short list of enemies, and he would actually be shot 5 times as he sat in a car with his girlfriend outside his Middle Village home. Now, there are people that were suspected of this hit, people that he supposedly disrespected, but this would create and start really the legend of Vito Guzzo Jr. He was a tough guy, and if you can survive being shot 5 times, we kind of have to start talking about you a little bit. In 1992 and early 1992, Vito Guzzo Jr. was very involved with the drug trade, and at one point got very involved with marijuana. At that point, Vito Guzzo and associate Anthony Tabita would lure 2 individuals, John Ruisi and Stephen Pagnozzi, to a social club in Queens. These 2 individuals allegedly had a large marijuana stash that both Guzzo and Tabita wanted to get their hands on. And as usual, in their case, if you're not going to get down or lay down, you're going to get down, basically. We're just going to kill you. Pagnozzi and Ruisi would not disclose the whereabouts of the marijuana deal, and they were shot multiple times by Tabita and Vito Guzzo Jr. Now, at one point, the pair would realize that one of the individuals was not dead as they were dousing them in gasoline. At that point, another member of the crew would throw a match on them and light them on fire. They would be found inside of a Nissan the day after. Now, this would really kind of show that these 2 individuals and this group, in a way, were very violent lunatics. Okay? This is the type of thing that cartels do, things of that nature. We don't hear about this much. And interestingly enough, lighting the car on fire is actually stuff that the Italian mafia in Naples and Sicily are doing. They're doing that on a regular basis. Most of the time in the mafia, you just shoot somebody in the head in America. These guys were coming together and doing very, very demented things to people they were killing. Now, there would come to be something that Vito Guzzo would have to take part in, and something that really kind of overstated the kind of people that the people in Cafe Giannini were. In really mid-1992, one of the members of the crew, the Cafe Giannini crew, Ralph Shula, a.k.a. Applehead, began kind of acting like a moron, according to people that knew him. Shula was a member of the Cafe Giannini crew, but he was always someone that, from what I understand, always had to prove himself to be a bigger gangster than everybody else. The difference between Ralph Shula and everyone else that was in this crew is most of the members of Cafe Giannini were the sons, nephews, brothers of people involved in the French Connection, the Pizza Connection. They were involved with members of the mob. Ralph Shula was one of the individuals that's family was not involved with the mob. And Shula always had to basically prove himself. He was basically called someone that eventually got too big for his britches and always kind of was just annoying people, always testing the limits of his friends, just kind of an annoying character. At one point, he started working with Bobby Glasses Vernace, who allegedly was very fond of Ralph Shula. One person that was not very fond of Ralph Shula was Vito Guzzo. Vito started hanging around with this crew and never really liked Shula, from what I understand. At one point, Shula just kind of really got under the skin of Vito Guzzo. And it was also alleged that Shula started making a lot of money, started acting like a big time gangster, and people were starting to get annoyed with it. At one point, Vito would talk very openly about he hated Shula and that Shula was no friend to him, and he would say that to Shula's face. Shula's days, that's not Shula, that's Shula. Shula's days were numbered. In August of 1992, he would be lured to the home of Fabio Bartolotta. Now, Bartolotta was the nephew of Paul Ragusa and son of Francesca Ragusa, who was very involved with the drug trade, as we know. Her son would become very involved. They would lure Shula to that home in August of 1992. It was actually alleged that Francesca Bartolotta was upstairs at the time of this hit, and it's unclear of whether she knew whether this was going on or not. But at that point, it was talked about that Vito Guzzo and Anthony Tabita would shoot Ralph Shula multiple times. Also at that hit were Joe O'Kane, and one of the individuals also involved was a person called John Clemenza. John Clemenza took part in getting rid of the evidence. Now, Clemenza is a real demented lunatic in his own right. He would actually have an individual, Peter Kafif, shoot his pregnant girlfriend who would not get an abortion at one point as well. Clemenza was a real sick ticket. He would be involved allegedly in this disposal as well. Vito Guzzo was not just killing rivals. He was killing members of the Giannini crew as well. It was also talked about that Bobby Glasses Vernace was absolutely furious at this hit and wanted some of his own revenge. Now, in November of 1992, this would become the big point of Vito Guzzo's career. This would finally be the time he could get revenge on Vinny Unions for the killing of his father about 4 or 5 years before. At that point in November of 1992, his mentor, Dennis Gazzato, would die. Now, it would actually come out that Dennis Gazzato, years later, was a mob informant. A lot of people don't know that. Dennis Gazzato was a rat, just like a Colombo member, Greg Scarpa as well. Gazzato would die, and it was actually talked about that at the wake, before the wake of Gazzato, Vito Guzzo would stalk Vinny Unions to a car on Caldwell Avenue in Queens. He would be riding alongside 2 other members of the mob. Guzzo would basically have a van, and he would block Vinny Unions and the members in. At that point, Vito Guzzo, Joe O'Kane, and other members of the Giannini crew would shoot up the car. Now, the problem for Vito Guzzo, though, was he did not hit Ricciardo. Ricciardo would escape without injury, really, and he would only kill another member of the crew, Anthony Messi. So he didn't actually get revenge. It was also talked about that after the hit, Vito Guzzo would go home, get changed, and go to the wake of Dennis Gazzato. That's the kind of guy Vito Guzzo was. He was all business, though he didn't ever actually get revenge on his father's killer. Now, between 1990 and 1994, Vito Guzzo, alongside other members of the Giannini crew, were taking part in all sorts of crimes, including extortion, drug trafficking, home invasions, robberies of banks, supermarkets, fur stores, hardware stores, pretty much anything they could get their hands on, including one situation where they actually hogtied members of a bank and robbed it in Middle Village. They were involved in a lot of different things. And a lot of this were generally done to kick up to members of the mafia and to really get the respect of mobsters. It was never actually proven, though, that they were told to do this by any member of the mob. Now, Vito Guzzo's crew would consist of a person called Anthony Corrado, Michael Cookie D'Urso, and Joe O'Kane. Now, Joe O'Kane was from the Howard Beach Ozone Park neighborhood, and at one point was very close with John Alight and John Gotti Jr. Now, eventually, Alight would be chased from the neighborhood, and John Gotti would take a higher-end position in the Gambino crime family. Joe O'Kane would actually ultimately could be convicted and sentenced to life in prison. He would be killed inside prison, which I'll get into in a later video. Now, Vito Guzzo would again, though, be shot 6 times in 1996. So keep in mind, you are not hearing things. Vito Guzzo in 2 different shootings was shot not once, not twice, not 5, not 10, but 11 times. This would basically cement the fact that whether or not Vito Guzzo was a lunatic, we all knew he was, but this would really cement his hood legend, if you will. Another Queens gangster, 50 Cent, was only shot 9 times. Guzzo had been shot 11 times, including in the neck, head, and spleen, which is crazy. This was wild. Now, at one point, the New York Daily News would call Vito Guzzo the next John Gotti. Now, in October of 1996, he would be provided with a weapon by Michael Cookie D'Urso. This weapon was allegedly to kill John Borello. Now, Borello would be killed in October of 1996 inside a car. Borello was a car thief and was a lunatic in his own right. He was a Gambino associate and is actually the cousin of Bonanno associate and mob informant Gene Borello. Borello would be killed inside a car, and allegedly at that point, the feds and NYPD believed Guzzo would do it. Guzzo would talk about this years later. In 1998, Vito Guzzo would finally be indicted on racketeering and murder charges. Several years previous, it was actually the actual other members of the Giannini Crew were indicted, including Bartolotta, Tabita, Ragusa, and other members of the crew. It would be until 1998 where Vito Guzzo would be indicted. Guzzo would actually admit to multiple murders, including John Borello, Ralph Shula, and the members Pugnozzi and Ruisi. In court, he would talk very openly, quote, "I killed Ralph Shula by shooting him in the head. I killed Anthony Messi by shooting him in that car as he tried to avenge his father. I shot John Borello." Now, notice he says, "I shot John Borello." It was talked about that the actual killer of John Borello was Anthony Tabita. Tabita would actually cooperate and is now in the witness protection program, but he didn't actually kill John Borello, but Vito Guzzo shot him and obviously wounded him. Vito would plead, and instead of going to trial, he would be sentenced to 38 years for 5 murders. Now, a lot of people are probably thinking, how did he not get life? Well, he basically had a good lawyer, and he was able to plead and escape either the death penalty or life in prison. Vito Guzzo is in prison still, and he is eligible for release in 2029, according to the BOP website. He is currently at FCI Danbury in Connecticut. There have been multiple pictures that have come out with Vito Guzzo in them. We can see him basically under the arm on the top left of Richard Gotti. He can be seen also in this picture with guys like Norman DuPont and Richard Gotti. There was actually a very published story that in 2015, Vito Guzzo would actually get into a large scrap inside FCI Danbury with members of a violent organization run by Albanians called the Rudai Organization. It was talked about very openly, according to Gangland News, that Vito Guzzo got into a large scrap with other members of the crime families with Nardino, Lenny Kaladi, and Prankish Big Frankie Ivazai. Ivazai and Kaladi were members of a violent crew called the Rudai Organization, and they had gotten into a scrap with another member of a crew that was at one point an associate of the mafia, and they basically angered Guzzo. Guzzo would actually be moved at one point to FCI Seagoville in Texas, but according to the website currently is back at FCI Danbury. Now, I do want to end this and say, look, in his 60s, Vito Guzzo, outside of getting a charge in prison, will get out of jail. We have to wonder what his future will hold. He will still be fairly young. Now, I do want to discuss and end this with his half-brother, Anthony Guzzo. Anthony Guzzo can be seen here on the left in a criminal conversation, we could allege, with mob informant John Panisi. At one point, Anthony Guzzo was involved with a weird situation involving a former guest of this show, Jack Garcia. At one point, Anthony Guzzo would serve time for manslaughter and aggravated assault. On the aggravated assault beef in state prison in New York, Guzzo claimed he had basically got a contract to kill Jack Garcia for $250,000. At one point, Guzzo would claim, quote, "I got a contract to get that motherfucker Falcone." Now, it would be talked about years later that this conversation was likely not true and never happened, but the FBI would talk to Guzzo about this alleged hit. He would boast about it, but it was never actually proven to be true. And in a conversation on John Panisi's YouTube channel, Sitdown News, he would also claim that it was not true and never actually happened. As I've said before, I have no ill will towards John Panisi, but it's important that we understand that most of the stories and a lot of the stories that a lot of these individuals talk about, whether it's Gravano or Franzese or people like John Panisi, we really have to research them and take them with a grain of salt. It's just my opinion. I don't have any ill will towards these individuals. I just think it's important that we check them out and put them to other sources of information. As I said, Vito Guzzo is 57 years old and is eligible for release in 2029. He is a violent individual, and in my estimation, one of the most violent of all the farm crews. As always, if you enjoy this video, please hit the like and subscribe buttons. We'll see you next week.